Okay, today we are going to look at the diesel engine, and the diesel is very much like the four-stroke engine with a few subtle differences, but this is now one of the most important engines worldwide when you think about the number of these engines that are used in shipping, in construction, transportation, every tractor trailer, every sort of piece of machinery that's yellow and black that you used for building things runs practically on a diesel. So let's have a look at it. Like always, we've got an animation that's running here. So let's just stop it and we'll back it up and let's see if we can figure out what's going on. So here we are at top dead center. And if we advance just one frame, of course, we're probably expecting to see an intake valve open, and we do. You can see the intake valve up here is opening as the piston is moving down inside the cylinder. Now, there's an interesting thing to note here, which is that there doesn't seem to be anything coming into the cylinder. Of course, that's not true. As soon as that valve opens and this piston is moving down inside the cylinder, there must be something coming in here. And the something is air. But you might be wondering, how do you run an engine on air? Well, we'll see that in a minute. So what's happening is that piston is moving down inside the cylinder and it's drawing in a big gulp of air. And if we look at the configuration of things right now, it looks like we can fairly accurately predict what's going to happen. This thing looks similar to a spark plug. This looks like the intake valve. That looks like an exhaust valve. But there's a subtle difference because we didn't see any fuel come into the cylinder. So let's see what happens. We now have a compression stroke. And remember, there's just air inside that cylinder that's getting compressed. But when we get to the top, something special is going to happen. And you can see it there. This device here is actually not a spark plug at all. It's what we call a diesel fuel injector. And the diesel fuel injector is spraying a fine mist of atomized diesel particles into this air. Now, the thing that you probably didn't think about was what had happened to the air when we compressed it. And that's kind of an interesting story. You see, when you take a bunch of air molecules and you force them into a smaller space, they vibrate a lot faster together because they're bumping into each other all the time. And that generates an awful lot of heat. In fact, the compression ratio on this engine is so much higher than it is in a gasoline engine that we've heated this air up to the point where it's above the flash point of diesel fuel. So this fuel will just automatically ignite in that hot air, and we can see that in the next frame. And now we get a flame front that moves out and, of course, pushes the piston back down. And if we've done our math right, the fuel will burn itself out by the time we get to bottom dead center, and then the exhaust stroke happens after that. Okay? And that process continues. So why the diesel? Why use this approach? Well, number one, we don't have to use any of the engine's power to actually generate an electric spark, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it actually does rob a lot of power from the engine to generate that electricity for the spark each time. The other thing is that by using a compression ratio where we're compressing this air a whole lot more, the diesel fuel gives us a whole lot more power on each stroke. And so we get an engine with very, very good low-end torque, which is perfect for pulling heavy loads or moving a boat or a ship or something like that. And so it's a better setup. Rudolf Diesel, who invented this engine, actually eventually went crazy, unfortunately. He was a very successful engineer, but he understood this idea of the heat being generated in the cylinder and thought that he could make his engine more efficient if he could actually keep the heat in the cylinder rather than radiating heat away from the cylinder. And he really never found any materials that he could use that wouldn't expand so much that made that impossible. To this day, diesel engines are still have to be cooled just like gasoline engines, and I don't think we'll get away from that anytime soon. So there is the diesel engine. intake, compression, power, and exhaust, but this time using a diesel injector instead of a spark plug. Now, a few of you may know, you'll be saying, but Mr. Kurtz, diesels have glow plugs. And that's true. A glow plug is a very different animal from a spark plug. A glow plug is basically like almost like a light bulb, and what its job is to warm up the inside of the cylinder before the first compression stroke, so that we're already dealing with some heated air that's inside the cylinder and not just the cold air that's available. So that's the job of the glow plug, and the glow plugs turn off before the first compression stroke. So when you start a diesel engine, there's often one position where you hold the key and you can see that the glow plug indicator light lights, and that will stay illuminated until the glow plug has actually warmed up the air inside the cylinder, and then the glow plug shuts off. You can turn the key the rest of the way and the engine should start. So there it is, that's the diesel. I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the other engines in here. Particularly, these are still fairly basic engines. This one here is the Wankel, most notably used in the Mazda RX-7, but also used in some performance race cars. Very different way to do internal combustion, where we have this off-center sort of rotor inside here that creates its combustion chamber down here. And of course, the advantage to this engine is that it starts with rotational energy. It doesn't start with up and down motion that has to be transferred into rotational energy. So that's the Wankel. And of course, the other one that I think everybody should probably know something about is about jet propulsion. And this is a typical rocket motor where we have a liquid fuel and actually two liquid fuels. Basically, you have a liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. You react those together in the combustion chamber, and you get expanded gases out the end, and we get thrust from this engine rather than a piston. We're basically just looking at gases being ejected out the back end, and if you have enough things being injected out the back end, then you get thrust in the opposite direction. The turbojet is a very similar animal, and I should actually explain that that's one that we will look at again later on this week, because I have a great video that's going to take you through how a turbojet engine actually works with a live demonstration of a cutaway. So there are a few things in there that you could look at, and certainly anything else that you think is worthy transportation-wise. I would say why not take a little bit of time to look at things like bullet trains, diesel locomotives. You could look at construction equipment using the diesel engine, or maybe find out some other vehicles that use a Wankel rotary engine. Or just Google around on jet propulsion and have a look at what is maybe happening at SpaceX or Virgin Galactic and some of the people who are making the next wave of spacefaring vehicles. Those would certainly be things that would be worthwhile in your journal entries.